Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Monday, October the 13th, 2025. Last Friday there was an explosion in Tennessee. I think it was in a factory making or researching or designing. I don't know quite what was happening in the factory, but it was an explosives plant, and there was an explosion which killed, I think, 16 people. And I think it might be a good idea to look at the horoscope of this explosion. One reason being that at the time of the explosion, there was a conjunction between the moon and Uranus. It wasn't an exact conjunction. I think it was 4 degrees separating. But I think that moon-Uranus conjunction, might have, had an impact. So this explosion is perhaps going to be the main theme of this video, and as far as the thumbnail is concerned, the picture on the top right is a part of the flag of Tennessee, because I want to talk about something going on in this state. But before I talk about this explosion, I want to consider the astrology and the I Ching of today, which is Monday, October the 13th, 2025. So here is the chart for today, set for noon, New York time, and at noon New York time the moon is in Cancer and it is making a conjunction to Jupiter. So it's arguably not a bad chart. I mean, at least from a perspective of the moon. So moon in Cancer, it's always good to have a moon in its own sign. And additionally, the moon is making a trine to Mars, and it's eventually going to make a trine to Saturn. So there are quite a lot of planets in water signs. You've got Moon, you've got Jupiter, Mercury, Mars, Saturn. So 5 planets in water signs. This maybe makes us think that there's almost a grand trine, and as the moon moves, well, it's not really quite there yet, is there? I mean, the moon will make a trine to Saturn in the end. I mean, I'm not saying it's really a grand trine day, but at least we have planets in all 3 water signs, and moon Jupiter conjunction, that's a really good aspect. It's fortunate because moon is in its own sign, Jupiter is exalted in Cancer, so a lot of things can work out with that conjunction, and it could be a day that is relatively emotional. That Venus opposition Saturn, which I was talking about over the weekend, is now separating. Venus is at 29:44 Virgo at noon New York time, and Saturn is at 26:51 Pisces. So Venus is moving away from that opposition to Saturn, and in fact Venus is entering Libra. So London time this evening at 19 minutes past 10, Venus moves into Libra. So if you're in the Americas, Venus will be moving into Libra sort of much earlier. So that is a huge change, Venus moving into Libra, in terms of Venus's dignity. Venus in Virgo isn't great. I mean, it's fallen in Virgo, and of course it's opposition Saturn. And so when Venus moves into Libra, Venus will still be opposition Saturn in a sort of a mathematical sense, but I think that opposition will lose a lot of its strength, because you're now dealing with an opposition which is dissociate. You've got Venus in Libra, opposition Saturn in Pisces. That really does sort of lose its power, and of course Venus is in its own sign. So we do have a transformation in Venus's condition. And with a strong Venus, you might say that this is a good time to be sociable. Perhaps relationships are going to work better. Additionally, when we think about Venus, we think about art and things that are beautiful. So maybe if you've been planning on buying something which you find to be beautiful or attractive or aesthetic or aesthetically pleasing, it might be easier to make the decision now that Venus is moving out of Virgo, because Venus in Virgo can be quite picky. And as far as other things are going on, well, you see, it sounds simple, doesn't it? Venus moving into Libra. That's great. But Venus is also on the Aries point. I mean, it's opposition the Aries point. So Venus on the Aries point, on the face of it, is about getting on with people and being able to reach out to the world at large, because it's the Aries point. It's not just about people, like relationships, people you meet in the street. It goes beyond that. And there may be a strong impetus towards getting on with people. Now, that's one way of looking at it. There may be alternative views. And the problem is that Venus is making a semi-square to Mars. And that really complicates the day. Venus and Mars are 45 degrees apart. Venus on the Aries point. Mars is sesquiquadrate the Aries point. There you can see there's Venus, Mars, 45 degrees apart. And so that kind of messes things up. So this is perhaps not a normal Venus moving into Libra. So just because Venus is moving into Libra doesn't always mean that your relationships are suddenly going to prosper. And we've got these two planets, Venus and Mars, the planets of the feminine and the masculine. Venus is about forming connections. Mars is about breaking things up, can be. It's quite an assertive, aggressive planet. And they're coming together in this semi-square. And so this could be problematic. And it may be with Venus semi-square Mars, despite our best efforts, we are very aware of the underlying friction. And from a sort of a global perspective, you could argue that Venus and Mars are both planets of war. I mean, in a way, Mars is a planet of war, Venus is a planet of victory. I mean, Venus, as a female form, you think of the Greek goddess Nike, and I think the Roman equivalent of Nike is Victoria. And so, it's not just about Venus. It's not just about fighting. It's about winning. And so, with Venus semi-square Mars, it might be, the struggle to be victorious. And of course, there are going to be winners and losers. So, that Venus semi-square Mars may actually be very competitive, but especially because it hits the Aries point. And I think that is the main thing to consider. It's an aspect that really could be quite destabilizing. And of course, Neptune is also involved. Venus is starting to move towards an opposition of Neptune. Mars is moving to a sesquiquadrate of Neptune. So it is part of a wider configuration. So it is great that Venus is moving into Libra. And I think perhaps on a personal level, Venus moving into Libra should help us get on with people. But maybe on a more collective and universal level, that Venus in Libra has to be seen in context, because it is semi-square Mars, and yes, Neptune is involved. And I don't want to be pessimistic. Again, from a personal level, it's not just the fact we got Venus moving into Libra. There's a conjunction between the Moon and Jupiter. So I do think that we can take advantage of it. So that is a picture set for New York. If we set the chart for Sydney, Australia, not a huge amount of difference. The Moon is earlier in the sign. The Moon is still in Cancer. The Moon-Jupiter conjunction is still there, but if you are in Australia or New Zealand, then that Moon-Jupiter conjunction and all the benefits of that Moon-Jupiter conjunction just may take a bit longer to take effect. And also that Venus moving into Libra, that would happen tomorrow. in Asia, Australia, New Zealand. That will happen tomorrow rather than today. So there's a bit of a difference there. And then there is the heliocentric view, putting the sun at the center of the solar system. Now that Mars opposition Uranus that I have been talking about for a long time, still there. And now we've got Mars opposition Uranus at the same time as we have got Venus semi-square Mars. So Mars opposition Uranus, it's potentially a difficult and maybe warlike aspect. I think there is a warlike feel to today. And people are trying to assert themselves. They're trying to make their position clear. And so that's something that we do need to think about. And the fact that Venus is on the T, we do have this T square. This T square was forming over the weekend, and so Venus is really activating the Mars-Uranus opposition. And so I do think that today overall that there may be scope for conflict or for hearing news about conflict and for things just happening. I mean, if we think about this Mars opposition Uranus, it's been forming for some time. I've been talking about it for some time. And maybe, for example, when we look at the explosion in the Tennessee explosives plant, that the Mars-Uranus opposition is going to perhaps be relevant there. And I will try to look at the heliocentric chart of the explosion as well as the geocentric chart. One thing I haven't mentioned is that Pluto is getting ready to go stationary direct, and I think that Pluto goes stationary direct, as far as I can see. Let me just get this straight. I should have mentioned it earlier. At 3:54 in the morning tomorrow, Tuesday, London time. So if you're in the Americas, then this evening Pluto comes to a standstill. That's the moment it stations. Are you going to feel anything? Not necessarily. I mean, you shouldn't just think of the precise moment when Pluto goes stationary direct. And I think we can see it as sort of a larger period of time. And I'll be looking at Pluto going stationary direct in more detail when I do my horoscopes for tomorrow, Tuesday. So now I'm going to switch to the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for today, which is Monday, October the 13th, 2025. Aries. We have a conjunction between the Moon and Jupiter in Cancer. And I think, Aries, that's probably what you should be focusing on. You have a chance with the Moon and Jupiter in Cancer to relax and to concentrate on what is important. What's really important. It's true, Aries, that you like to be free. You like to take any chance, any opportunity to assert yourself, if you are a typical Aries. But you can't be asserting yourself all the time, and sometimes you have to just recognize what is genuinely important. And this Moon Jupiter conjunction allows you to relax, perhaps spend time at home. Maybe it's a long weekend. Or maybe you should regard it as a long weekend. Just because it's Monday doesn't mean you immediately have to be doing stuff. Maybe you need to slowly reintegrate yourself with life, with perhaps the working week. But you don't be in too much of a rush. And also with this Moon Jupiter conjunction, the best things are close to home. You don't have to go a long way to find them. And if you are able to in a way, restrict your horizons, apparently restrict your horizons, I think that you would be giving a boost to your luck. If you think that you have to go to the other side of the world to find something, I think you might be wrong. And also, if you find yourself going further afield and sort of perhaps meeting new people, having new experiences, or trying to have new experiences, that might not necessarily work. Because one aspect we do have today is a semisquare between Venus and Mars. So, Mars is, of course, your ruling planet. Venus is a planet that is often connected with relationships. And so with Venus semisquare Mars, that might indicate trouble from an outside source. Could be from another person. With Venus semisquare Mars, it might occur to you that you and another person simply just don't get on with each other. Or at the very least, that there is an incompatibility. Now, we can have incompatibilities with anyone. I mean, even if you're spending your whole life with someone, it's likely that there are going to be areas of incompatibility. And any incompatibilities at the moment with that Venus semisquare Mars are perhaps going to be significant. So other people need to be treated with a degree of caution, and probably, it's a bad time to be embarking on new relationships, again, whatever that relationship is about, because things may get difficult very quickly. It might all seem very easy, but it might not be. And so, be careful, with this Venus semisquare Mars, because it could be problematic. Additionally, we have a last quarter moon. So we had a full moon, about a week ago, and the moon is now square the sun. And this last quarter moon is in cardinal signs. You got moon in Cancer, sun in Libra. Therefore, it's likely to have some impact on you. And you may be aware that just something is just not working right, and you have to push. And what is it? And of course, you don't really want to do anything like that, because fundamentally, you want to just do things according to your own plans. You don't really want to go out of your way and do things another person's way. As I've already indicated, other people could be problematic today. Yet this first quarter moon could well be about other people, and you perhaps realize the clash between maybe what other people want and what you want. And does something have to give? It's possible that something does have to give in the end. And so you have to think about, what are you doing with this lunar cycle? What are your plans for the last week of the lunar cycle before the new moon? So it might occur to you that you have to handle people in the right way, and it's going to be difficult, and you have to also make the most of your strengths. And I think your key strength at the moment is just holding on to who you are, and that should be something very obvious for an Aries. Not feeling you have to be someone else, but you still feel the challenge. You still feel that if you go about things in the wrong way, other people might get the upper hand. I mean, they shouldn't get the upper hand. They won't get the upper hand, but it's still, your concern. And just maybe, Aries, before you do anything, you need to make sure that your own house is in order, that you feel comfortable in your own skin. And that's perhaps what you should be working on today. Taurus. There is a conjunction between the moon and Jupiter. That's probably the best thing going on today. The moon is pretty close to Jupiter. Now, if you're in the Americas, this conjunction is particularly prominent. If you're in Australasia, it's still forming. The Moon and Jupiter are still in Cancer, but maybe this Moon-Jupiter conjunction, won't be exact until tomorrow. But it doesn't matter where you are. This Moon-Jupiter conjunction is just going to make you feel comfortable. And from a Taurean perspective, the Moon and Jupiter are in the third sign from Taurus. You could say the third house. And in astrology, it is said that the moon joys in the third house. So when the moon is in the third, that's just the right place for the moon to be in. The moon is a planet of communication. We sometimes forget that. And the third house can be a planet of communication. But it's communication not in a sort of mental way. It's more sort of emotional communication. And with the moon making a conjunction to Jupiter, you have the opportunity, Taurus, to really express yourself, as you are. You don't have to be anything you're not, and there might be a certain lightness to today. You just don't take anything too seriously. Go with the flow, do what you enjoy, and if you go about things in a fairly spontaneous way, things should be fine, and something might happen which reminds you about how good things are. It's perhaps the small pleasures. It's not the large pleasures. It's just the small things that you just you enjoy, you relax, you hang out, you just can sort of be yourself, and that's perhaps what you should be focusing on. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is straightforward. One thing going on is that Venus is changing sign, and Venus is, of course, your ruler. And so, when Venus changes sign, that is a big deal. Perhaps, the whole way you express yourself, may change. And recently, well, not recently, just over the last couple of days, Venus has been opposition Saturn. And I think that this Venus opposition Saturn, for the average Taurean, might have been something of a problem. Venus opposition Saturn, you could say, well, that's perhaps hindering, the way you express yourself. Here's you, Venus in Virgo, trying to be yourself, trying to be creative, trying to make the most of everything, and then you hit an opposition to Saturn. What is holding you up? I think in a previous video I suggested that maybe other people are holding you up. Perhaps your friends have not always been particularly sympathetic to your needs, and they've had their own ideas, and you've been tempted to sort of fit in with those ideas and to kind of do what you're told. But this is coming to an end, this battle where you're always having to think about what you want to do, what other people want to do, Venus opposition Saturn, and perhaps you often felt that you weren't fully able to express yourself. But then Venus moving into Libra, Venus is moving into its own sign. Venus is also moving on to the Aries point, and that matters regardless of whether it's in Libra or Aries. It's just Venus conjunct the Aries point. And so this is a time when Taureans can very much think about themselves and the world. Where do you fit in? And it's ideally shouldn't just be in some local sense, thinking about the planet, everyone on this planet, how people cooperate, and also maybe how you deliver your message and how you are impacted by the things going on out there. And you shouldn't regard yourself, Taurus, as just being helpless. We can all think ourselves as being helpless. Remember, I have Taurus rising, and it's not just a Taurus thing, because we have these sort of huge events going on. You think about the economy and AI and wars, and it seems that just everything is out of control. And what can we do? We just get carried along. And it's easy to think that, and it's obvious to think that, but you shouldn't think that. You should always ask yourself, what can you do to contribute? What can you do to moderate whatever is happening? It might seem, global events, what can you do? But maybe there is something you can do in your own small way. And at the very least, you can inform yourself, and you will be informed. And perhaps by understanding the world around you, with Venus on the Aries point, or at least opposition the Aries point, you're going to perhaps have a sense of integration. At least you understand what's going on. You don't feel yourself to be just quite so much of a passenger. And Venus moving into Libra, Venus is moving into its own sign, and Venus rules Libra, so that's not so bad. And it does indicate that that you can take control and you can feel better about yourself. And the way you do that is by doing things your way. You have your own ideas about the way things should be arranged. You have your own ideas about what is harmonious, what feels good, what feels appropriate. You have your own ideas, and you have your also your own ideas about things like planning and how routines should be sorted out. And Venus in Libra does allow you to actually execute these ideas in your own way. You don't have to announce anything, you just do it. And it's a quiet process. Indeed, it might be the case that the less you announce something, the more effective it's going to be, because if people don't know what you're going to be doing, if people are not involved with what you're doing, well, they're not really in a position to interfere, are they? Now, Venus is additionally making a semi-square to Mars, because there's really quite a lot happening this week. I mean, it's quite concentrated. When I say this week, today, there's some quite concentrated activity. Venus going into Libra, Moon conjunct Jupiter, and Venus semi-square Mars. And Venus semi-square Mars, it can be a difficult aspect, and it can be about you and another person. Mars is right in the middle of Scorpio, right in the middle, 15 Scorpio, moving towards 15 Scorpio. So you could say that Mars is really very strong. Mars is making a 135-degree aspect to the Aries point. And Mars can represent another person who is probably very stubborn, very focused on him or herself. More likely to be himself, though, because Mars is a male planet. But it needn't be. It depends on the situation. But Mars can be stubborn, and there's Venus semi-square Mars, you trying to deal with another person, and it can be hard work. And Venus and Mars are both aspecting the Aries point, so it can be a struggle. It can be a real struggle. And so when you're dealing with one-to-one relationships, I think you'd probably need to be quite mature, and you need to really think things through and accept that not everyone can be convinced. And if someone wants to do something, well, let them perhaps get on with it, but don't forget your own needs. I think it's very important for Taurus to make its own decisions. So you don't want to get into a situation where someone wants you to do something, and they're very stubborn about wanting you to do something. They refuse to compromise. Well, in that situation, probably Taurus, you have to put your foot down. You have to think about your own needs. And so maybe if you're dealing with people who are very dogmatic and who are quite controlling, well, maybe you shouldn't be dealing with them. Maybe you should be staying out of their way. Gemini. There is a possibility, Gemini, that the financial side of things is emphasized. And the reason for that is the moon is in Cancer, Jupiter is in Cancer. There is a conjunction between the moon and Jupiter. And also it's Monday, it's the start of a new week, if you take the view that Monday is the first day of a week. And so the financial side of things inevitably could come to the fore. Now, Gemini, that might not be something that you necessarily want to bother with, but maybe you should. I think that if you make the effort, I think that you can have quite a powerful influence, and your views on money and your ideas about how people should be sort of using their money or saving their money, spending their money, are going to matter. You're going to regard it as being of some significance. Now, with the moon making a conjunction to Jupiter in Cancer, you might say that this could indicate financial good luck. You can be lucky with money. Now, I'm not saying you should gamble or anything like that. That is not that kind of luck. But if you think for yourself and you're sensible, I think that you can indeed be attracting good luck. So don't ignore the financial dimension, and give it your best. You could say that Jupiter represents a higher principle. It is a planet of good luck, and it wants you to be successful. But if you want to be if you want to be successful, you have to do things Jupiter's way. And I think that with Jupiter, you always have to put in maximum effort, because as I say every now and then, Jupiter can be so disappointing. If we just assume that Jupiter's going to come up with the goods, then it's just not going to happen. And so that's one way in which this Moon Jupiter conjunction could be working. Additionally, we have a first quarter moon. So the Sun is in Libra. Sorry, last quarter moon, because we've had a full moon a week ago, and now we've got a week left before the new moon. So this last quarter moon in Cancer square the Sun in Libra, can represent a moment of indecision when you're not quite sure what to do next. And it could be, Gemini, that you really feel that there are things that you enjoy doing. You kind of know what you like. You know what gives you pleasure. But the moon in Cancer is challenging that. And it could be that you are looking at what you enjoy, looking at the kind of life you'd like to be leading. And it might be that the material side of things seems to be in the way. If it wasn't for the money issue, if it wasn't for the fact that something was so expensive, if it wasn't for the fact that you had to earn a living or whatever it is, or that you had to save your money for the future, if it wasn't for all of that, there would be so much you could do. And so you might be having those kind of feelings. And there is an indication here with this, last quarter moon, that there is a way of managing the issue. And it's not about spending money, I don't think. Rather, it's about recognizing that you can be everything you want to be without having to worry about the financial dimension. Perhaps you've overthought it, and you thought it's about, buying stuff, expending huge amounts of money, but maybe there's just a basic laziness there. There was always a way of doing something, and it would cost you nothing or very little, but you hadn't been bothered. So it could be something like that with this last quarter moon. And so perhaps you need to develop the right relationship with money, and there might be a challenge there. Now, one other thing going on, Gemini, is that Venus is moving out of Virgo into Libra, and that means that the final vestiges of the Virgo season are over. And Venus out of Virgo moving into Libra, for you, Gemini, I think that that's certainly good news. It means that you've got Venus moving into an air sign. With Venus in Virgo, you haven't been entirely comfortable with it. It might have meant that you had to spend perhaps more time than you wanted to do worrying about maybe domestic issues, dealing with other people's domestic issues. There were times when certain other people could have felt themselves to be, a bit boring. Plus, this Venus opposition Saturn had been weighing on you over the weekend, and having these feelings of responsibility and were you doing the right thing? And then Venus moves into Libra, and just things are so much easier, and you can perhaps be yourself, and that might relate to what I was saying earlier about what is it that you're good at? What is it that you want to do? You felt perhaps you had been denied by material reality, but things are changing now. And I think Venus in Libra does make you feel more confident and more optimistic. And when Venus moves into Libra, it does make a trine to Uranus, as I'll be talking about very soon. Okay, that Venus trine Uranus isn't exact today, but it will be exact over the next couple of days, and I'll be talking about that. But that Venus trine Uranus and Venus trine Pluto, in fact, grand trine in air signs. Venus in Libra, trine Uranus in Gemini, trine Pluto in Aquarius. It's all going to start to move. And so I think over the next few days, Gemini, I think you're going to start to really feel the benefits of Venus moving into Libra. Cancer. I think, Cancer, that things are looking pretty good at the moment. They have been improving slowly, and I hope that you didn't have a bad weekend. And now you've hit the new week. You have opportunities, and hopefully you're feeling pretty good about what you can do. I mean, you should be feeling pretty good, because at the moment, Cancer, there's something about you that is very free flowing, and you understand how everything works. You have a really quite powerful insight into what other people are thinking and feeling, and additionally, you yourself can make changes, and you can make things better. And the reason you can make things better is because there's a conjunction between the Moon and Jupiter. Moon and Jupiter, this conjunction, it's in Cancer, it's in your sign, and it doesn't just make you feel positive and optimistic. I mean, it can, it should, but it also says something about the energy you are emanating, and you can emanate a very positive, inspiring energy that other people are very much going to pick up on, and you can sort of light things up. Okay, maybe light things up is a bit too strong, because this Moon-Jupiter conjunction is in Cancer. It's not like it's in a fire sign or an air sign. There's a sort of passivity to that Moon conjunct Jupiter, but you can generally be at the center of, if you like, an aura or a cloud of comfort. And yeah, you can make other people feel comfortable. And so, that is something you need to work on, or you don't need to do anything, by the way, something you perhaps can work on. And so be positive, be optimistic, and I think a lot of people are going to just enjoy being close to you. Now, there is a last quarter moon, so the lunar cycle is coming towards its end, and in a week's time we've got a new moon, and that new moon is on the 21st. That new moon is at 28. Is at 28 Libra, 28 Libra. So we've got a new moon coming up, and this just over a week's time, the new moon. But with this last quarter moon, you're thinking about, well, what is there left to do? What is unfinished? And you have made a certain amount of progress, but there still seems to be something missing, something that you still feel that you need to do. And it could be that the missing ingredient is you yourself. You have perhaps been involved with something and it's been making a certain amount of progress, but you haven't necessarily had much input. And this is especially the case if other people have also been involved. Maybe your family, has been doing something, or it could be something relating to your work. It doesn't matter which. It's something. But the question is, where are you? And I think that with the moon strong in Cancer, moving towards a conjunction of Jupiter, what you need to do is make it clear, who you are, what your opinions are, and how you'd like things to change. And you need to make a contribution now, because if you don't make a contribution now, beginning of this week, then things can just go on without you, and decisions can be made, and you might find that you're dealing with something that you had no control over, or you felt you had no control over. You realize that it's just not you. So participation really matters, and it's got to be direct participation, and you've got to just remember who you are. Cancer is a strong sign. Cancer does have strong opinions, and so it could be a case, Cancer, with this last quarter moon, speak now or forever hold your peace. If you keep quiet, let everything continue without you, when in the end there could be a problem. But Cancer, that would be so unnecessary. I think that now is a time when you really can make your opinions felt, and heard, loud and clear. Leo, there is a last quarter moon. The moon is in Cancer and the sun is in Libra. And it's always important to just follow the lunar cycle, particularly if you're a Leo, because the sun is your ruler, and so with the sun moving through Libra, it could have been, or is, a time when perhaps there are places you've been going to, things you've been saying, and things might have been moving, at a good pace, not necessarily a super fast pace, but a pace which was good enough for you. And now, with the last quarter moon, you might stop and think and be asking yourself, where is this going? What does it all mean? And maybe you had just sort of taken things for granted, or you just assumed that things were going to move from one stage to another stage. And now with this last quarter moon, you're asking yourself, whether this is really right. And you can start to see perhaps how things could go wrong if they continue in the way they have been moving. And so, Leo, it might be a time to stop and think and reflect. Rather than feel that you always have to say something, you always have to be doing something, you always have to be going somewhere. I don't think that is necessarily the case. So if you can just pause, I think that might be a very good thing. And I don't think there's anything in particular that you have to communicate. But still, Leo, there are going to be some sort of realizations going on, realizations that may in their own way be quite important. And also, Leo, Venus is changing sign. Venus is moving out of Virgo into Libra. And this sign change, I think, is quite useful for you. I don't think you've been entirely happy with Venus moving through Virgo. It could have been, Leo, that you just felt that certain things were difficult. They took longer than expected, and you might have been quite disappointed with certain other people, not necessarily people you were super close to, but other people's reactions and their concerns. It wasn't great. That would especially be the case if you were working. If the last couple of weeks, if you're in a job, might have been a little tedious, and there was just a lot of small things that had to be worked out, and it was a pain. Even if you're applying for a job, it was just all a bit too complicated, a bit more complicated than it should have been. And with Venus moving into Libra, things are easier, and it's just you're going to find it just easier to be yourself. And you might also see a change in other people. Other people are perhaps going to be less obsessed about detail. You might find that you make one small mistake, you say something wrong, and that's seen as being a complete indictment on yourself and who you are. People can be like that. And now with Venus moving into Libra, there is a change, and you're feeling better, and it's just easier. It is easier to be yourself. And Venus at the same time, it's making a semi-square to Mars. So at first there might be resistance to this change. You might refuse to believe that things are changing, and you might then sort of be unnecessarily aggressive, or you keeping things to yourself, continuing to assume that things are difficult when actually things have changed. So allow things to develop in their own way, and be ready to accept that people can change, not in a super dramatic way. I mean, people don't change. But over the next few weeks, you'll realize that people will change enough to make your life easier. Virgo. Right now, Virgo, Venus is at the end of the sign. Venus is in the absolute last quarter of the last degree of Virgo, getting ready to move into Libra. In fact, Venus moves into Libra at, I think, 19 minutes past 10 in the evening, London time. So, this afternoon, if you're in the Americas, Venus will move into Libra. It might be sometime today if you're in Australia or New Zealand. But Venus leaving your sign is possibly a good thing. I mean, it's been nice having Venus moving through Virgo, I hope. Venus in Virgo has perhaps allowed you to open up, communicate with people, get on with people. Venus is the planet of relationships in your sign. It may say something about how you present yourself, but the last sort of week, it hasn't perhaps always been easy. Venus has been in Virgo, but it's been making an opposition to Saturn, and that Venus opposition Saturn, is a problem, or has been a problem. And you've perhaps become aware of how you have been restricted, and you haven't always been able to do things your way. And Venus moving into Libra does change that. The pressure is now off. You don't have to worry so much about the social environment, and you can start to do things your way, and perhaps do things you enjoy. And being a Virgo, also concentrate on things that you personally find to be important. And when Venus moves into Libra, as it does today, or perhaps tomorrow, when Venus moves into Libra, it makes a trine to Uranus, it makes a trine to Pluto. We've got a grand trine coming up. I think that Venus trine Uranus is especially significant because Uranus is in an angular sign from a Virgo perspective. And so as Venus moves into Libra, you start to see a new possibility. a new possibility, maybe in quite a material way, something that you can definitely benefit from, profit from. It could be exciting. At least you find it exciting. Maybe no one else finds it exciting, but that doesn't matter. And so interesting things will start to emerge when Venus moves into Libra, and the pressure is going to be off. You're not going to have to spend time having to please other people, worrying about what other people think, worrying about that sort of constant balance between you and others. Are you being selfish? Are you being not selfish enough? So that's going to I think make it more straightforward for you. And additionally, Virgo, you can start to concentrate on what is important. And I think that one thing that will become important as Venus moves through Libra is money, and having the right attitude to money. And with Venus trine Uranus and Venus trine Pluto, I think that you may start to be in touch with some sort of wider energy with the changing world, and it can be very challenging being in this changing world. But everyone has a niche. Everyone has a niche at a particular time in their life, and they also have a possibility for benefiting from those changes. And I think you can. And I think this is something I need to discuss further. I think I'll probably be talking about it, tomorrow or the day after, when those trines between Venus and Uranus, Venus and Pluto, are exact. Libra. Good news, Libra. Venus is moving into your sign. And you've already got the Sun in Libra, but now you've got the Venus in Libra. Yeah, well, what's there to complain about? Well, there is a few things to complain about, but with Venus in Libra, there is a big transition here. Venus's position has radically changed. Venus at the end of Virgo was in a pretty poor state. It was in a sign in which it was fallen, and also it was opposition Saturn. And so some Librans might have been feeling somewhat sorry for themselves. They might have felt they couldn't be themselves. I mean, maybe from the perspective of your own feelings of well-being, it might not have been great. You felt you weren't firing on all cylinders. Maybe something was holding you back. There could have been perhaps concerns about health. I mean, when I say concerns about health, I don't think I mean that in any serious or clinical sense. It's just, you might have just felt that you just weren't completely there physically, psychologically, and maybe even spiritually as well. But now that Venus is moving into Libra, it's a rapid transformation. Venus is suddenly in good shape. It's in its own sign, and you may feel that you've arrived, that you're now in a world that you have some understanding of, and that you can have some impact on. People are going to listen to you. You know how to project yourself. I mean, Librans always know how to project themselves. I mean, Libra is a very sociable sign, but now that with Venus is moving into Libra, you can be more sociable than usual, and you can be yourself. But when Venus moves into Libra, it straight away makes a semisquare to Mars. I mean, in fact, it made that semisquare to Mars just before moving into Libra, because the precise semisquare was when Mars was at something like 14.5 Scorpio, and Venus was at 29.5 Virgo, or something like that. And so the Venus semisquare Mars energy, which you could say is actually happening just before Venus moves into Libra. So Venus moving into Libra could be just a sense of relief that something is over, but just before it, Venus semisquare Mars, Mars is a planet which is often associated in a Libra horoscope with relationships. And so Venus semisquare Mars might be about you trying to deal with another person, but it not necessarily working out, being aware that you and someone else are different from one another. And so that perhaps needs to be negotiated, and the problems could be particularly intense if money is an issue. So if you and another person have a disagreement about money, well, that could be a problem. But that's not the only way of looking at this Venus semi-square Mars. We could look at it in a more positive way and say, well, Venus is being influenced by Mars. Mars is having an impact on how Venus works, and so Mars is perhaps making you more charismatic and better able to defend yourself. So it's not all bad, this Venus semi-square Mars. And of course, Venus Mars as a pair can be pretty charismatic and attractive. And so as Venus makes the transition from Virgo to Libra, as it makes this semi-square to Mars, you can present a new side to yourself, an attractive and charismatic side that has an edge. Yeah, you can have an edge, and people will pay attention to this. And maybe if you handle things correctly with this Venus semi-square Mars, you have a chance to really help things and make things go your way. People will listen to you. And one final point, shouldn't forget last quarter moon. We've got a new moon coming up in just over a week's time, I think at around 28 degrees Libra. So we've now got moon in Cancer, square sun in Libra. And I think that this last quarter moon is pretty useful for you. It is a time of decision, a time of crisis. It's a time when you're starting to think, well, things are gone so far, but what are you going to do? How are you going to make an impact? And so with this last quarter moon hitting major angles in your chart, it is something really that you need to take advantage of. And this last quarter moon is linked up with Jupiter, because we have a moon-Jupiter conjunction in Cancer, a square of the sun. And I think that it works for you, and this particularly works for you if you are ambitious. If you've got particular ambitions that you want to proceed with, I think this last quarter moon will at the very least show you, Libra, how you can get them, how you can get what you want. So Libra, don't hold back. If something is important and you want it now, then do whatever it takes to get it. And this last quarter moon may be particularly relevant if you're working or if you're looking for a job. If you're concerned about how you are progressing, then you see the answer. You see perhaps what hasn't been done in the past, and you now realize that you just want to get on with it, as soon as possible. Scorpio, I'm quite optimistic about today for you. There are a lot of planets in water signs. Got Moon and Jupiter in Cancer, Mercury, Mars in Scorpio, Saturn in Pisces. You, as a water sign, should really benefit from all of this. There is an emotional flow to today, which should really help you to move forward. Right at the beginning of the day, the Moon is making a trine to Mars, and then it moves on to conjunction of Jupiter, and that really is pretty fortunate. And the key to making the most of all of this is to be as open-minded as possible. Now, Scorpios can sometimes be too focused on their own material, on their own agenda, and there can be a certain rigidity to the average Scorpio. I mean, after all, Scorpio is a fixed sign, and you can be quite defensive. You don't necessarily want to experiment because who knows what might happen. But at the moment, with this, well, particularly the conjunction between the Moon and Jupiter, you really need to see everything, as it is, and as far as is possible to sort of abandon some of your expectations and perhaps prejudices. I mean, I'm not saying you're a prejudiced person, but we're all prejudiced to some extent. We all have ideas about the way things should be, and we assume things are going to work out in a particular way, and if they don't, or if they appear not to be going to plan, then we might get upset about it, or we might retreat. But that's a good reason, Scorpio, for you to be as open-minded as possible and not to get caught by sort of petty struggles, petty disagreements over things which really aren't very important. And perhaps the thing to be looking at is a semisquare between Venus and Mars. Now, this Venus semisquare Mars could spoil the day. I'm not saying it will spoil the day, but it could. And the problem with this Venus semisquare Mars is that Mars is well placed in Scorpio. Not just well placed in Scorpio. Mars is right in the middle of Scorpio. Mars is at 15 Scorpio. It's or 14, 15 Scorpio. It's at a real center of a fixed sign, and so it doesn't want to budge. As I've already said, I think you should try to budge to some extent. And then Venus making the semisquare. Venus represents perhaps something from the outside, something that you don't necessarily want to bother with, but it may be challenging you, it may be irritating you, it may be getting your attention, but your first reaction is not very positive. It's a pain. It's not something you want to bother with. And there's a danger that Mars digs in. Of course, Mars is you. Mars is ruler of Scorpio. So it doesn't respond, and it sort of goes into a defensive mode. And so this Venus semisquare Mars, you can see how difficult it could be. I mean, it might be difficult as far as relationships are concerned. I mean, that would be a classic interpretation of this Venus semisquare Mars, because Venus is ruler of Taurus, your opposite sign. Mars is, of course, your ruler. So the symbolism is there for a disagreement or a misunderstanding, or you just feeling that you don't want to be bothered. And you might put people off, or you might not even just want to engage. So this Venus semisquare Mars could be a real problem if you don't handle it in the right way. Now, there are alternative ways of looking at this Venus semisquare Mars. It could be seen as, you could say, well, Venus is making an aspect to Mars. It doesn't matter that it's a semisquare. It's just an aspect. And of course, Venus is a planet of relating, being with people, wanting to make connections. And so you have the opportunity here of sort of reversing the situation. What could have caused you to batten down the hatches, to really be quite aggressive, could make you very accommodating. And maybe it all depends on your state of mind and what you regard as being important. And right now, Scorpio, the fewer things you regard as being important, probably the better. Because if you regard something as important, very, very important, then you might become defensive. You might become protective. And right now you need a perspective. A lot of things don't matter. They don't have anything to do with you. If you are able to compromise these things, perhaps even give them away, doesn't matter. It doesn't affect who you are. Now, there are always going to be things that you can't compromise on, that you can't give away. But you're dealing with your core, and we're not talking about the core. We're just perhaps dealing with your perceptions. And I said, right at the beginning of this piece on Scorpio, that the more open-minded you can be, the better. The more relaxed, easygoing you can be, the better. And if you can be relaxed and easygoing, then everything does start to work in your favor. That Venus semisquare Mars, which could have been difficult, actually becomes an advantage. It makes you charismatic. It makes you attractive. It also allows you to make the most of the fact that there is a conjunction between the Moon and Jupiter. Moon and Jupiter in Cancer. That's a great conjunction, and that conjunction allows you, to rise above, your immediate circumstances, to see something beyond. And once you see the beyond, then you realize that some of your immediate worries are not really worries at all, and that you really can move on and be quite happy. So it can be a great day if you want it to be a great day, if you can let go. So that's perhaps what you should be concentrating on. Sagittarius. I'm not someone who is particularly good at finishing social contacts. I think that's for me is the most difficult part of it. Whether it's a phone call, whether it's a conversation, bringing it to an end is always a problem. Coming up with the right words, and I like to sort of use particular words like anyway. When I use anyway, I often use the word anyway, where I'm just trying to work out how to end something, whether it's an email or a conversation or a phone conversation. So it can be a problem. So I'm talking about myself, and of course I'm a Gemini. I'm not a Sagittarius. And as far as you're concerned, why this might be relevant to you is that I do think that endings do matter for you, Sagittarius. How you finish a conversation, how you wrap things up. Things might be going very well. You might be progressing towards, a successful conclusion to something. And then, right at the end, perhaps someone is in a hurry, perhaps you're in a hurry, perhaps another person is in a hurry, the other person is in a hurry. Something gets forgotten. Things are just too hasty, too abrupt, or there's a danger of just spoiling something by just saying something you weren't planning on doing. You say it and it just wrecks everything. So when you are interacting with people and organizations, whoever you're involved with, do really concentrate on the endings. Don't be in too much of a hurry. I mean, don't linger. You can't linger forever. I can be quite bad at lingering, but you don't want to linger too long. But you have to, as far as is possible, tie things up in a sort of neat way. I think that's going to be very important. Particularly if you're dealing with something that is perhaps relating to your work or money, or you're dealing with someone you regard as being important, someone you want to continue your relationship with, for whatever reason, even if your reason is completely transactional. It probably is quite transactional. There's nothing wrong with something being transactional. But, being polite about endings, I think Sagittarius does matter. And, of course, being a Sagittarius, you can be abrupt. You can think, well, okay, this has come to an end. Let's just finish it now. But the niceties do have to be considered. So that's one way of looking at today. I think that is a possible problem area, but it shouldn't define the day. Far from it. I mean, we do have Venus moving into Libra, and Venus moving into Libra, as far as you're concerned, I think does allow you to lighten up. Perhaps recently you have been seeing other people as being difficult. You had to deal with them, but did you really want to deal with them? Not really. And with Venus moving into Libra, I think you can be more friendly. You can be sort of more relaxed. And as far as your social life, Venus moving through Libra, that is a great place for Libra to be. So over the next few weeks, I think that there is a good chance that your social life is going to sort of pick up. And it's often a time of year, isn't it? Around sort of as we approach Halloween and getting on towards Christmas, where certainly in the northern hemisphere people are more friendly. They're sort of getting ready for the winter, and so that perhaps you can start to, in an early way, start to get into the seasonal spirit. Yeah, I mean, I know it's still mid-October, but this is kind of when it all starts. And of course, being in the United States, I just noticed that people really put up their decorations early. I think that the Halloween decorations started going up sort of early September, and of course, the moment Halloween is over, then people start thinking about their Christmas decorations. They don't even necessarily wait until Thanksgiving. So that's something that I think is optimistic, but from a social view, getting things right and getting the formalities right really is going to matter, and you should be able to deal with it. You really should be able to handle it, because at the moment we've got the Moon and Jupiter in Cancer. Jupiter's been in Cancer for some time. Jupiter is your ruler. We've got a Moon conjunct Jupiter. So with Moon conjunct Jupiter, that does indicate to me, Sagittarius, that you're capable of being very sensitive. You can be warm, you can be friendly, and you can understand the subtle signals. Now, normally, Sagittarius, this is not something you're necessarily very good at. Sagittarius just likes to take action, does what it feels is appropriate. It's an exciting sign, likes to move from one place to another quickly. But with the Moon Jupiter conjunction, you can be more reflective, and you can be emotionally reflective, and you can understand what needs to be done, how it is best to behave. So Sagittarius, it's a day when a bit of subtlety, particularly social subtlety, can go a long way. Capricorn. Venus is moving into Libra, and I think that Venus moving into Libra is something that should be pretty good for most Capricorns. Libra is an important sign. It's a sign in the Capricorn horoscope that is often connected with status and your ambitions. Whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. And so when Venus moves into Libra, of course, when Venus moves into Libra, it moves into its own sign. Venus is ruler of Libra. So this should really help you, Capricorn, in terms of focusing on what is important to you, and also presenting all of this to the world. People can understand why it all matters, and you can be taken seriously, and additionally, you'll know how to behave. You'll know what to say. So, with Venus in Libra, particularly now, when Venus is opposition the Aries point, it's a very important place for Venus. You know how to present your ambitions, and so if there's anything you want that you have been sort of working on. Perhaps you've been working on it in a sort of a mental level, and now it's perhaps time to talk about it, to be open about it, and also to consider your image. Venus in Libra can be quite image conscious. I know that image is supposed to be fairly unimportant. We should be thinking about the substance rather than the style, but at the moment, Capricorn, the way you present yourself, does matter. Or rather, it needn't matter. You can ignore the way you present yourself. But if you really want to have maximum impact with Venus moving into Libra, then do think about, what you are wearing, what you look like, what those first impressions are. It's not necessarily about beauty and looking good. It's about looking right and looking appropriate. You have to think about the times you're living in, the overall environment, and what people are expecting. So that would just be a bonus. And so Capricorn, you really do have a chance to present yourself really, really well. And because you can present yourself well, that means that you can get results. And don't just don't forget about other people. Other people do matter. We do have a last quarter moon. The moon in Cancer is square the sun. So, we've got a new moon in just over a week's time. And so with this last quarter moon, perhaps other people are the final key. Getting certain people onto your side would really help. It's not something you necessarily want to do. Why bother? You know what you need to do. Perhaps you feel you can do it on your own. But it could be in certain situations that you've reached a certain stage where if you really want to make progress, if you want to see something through to completion, you might need some outside assistance. And perhaps that is the challenge of this this last quarter moon. Maybe recently, over the last few days, you felt you didn't have that support. Maybe that was to do with the fact that Venus was making an opposition to Saturn. Remember, Saturn is your ruler, so that Venus opposition Saturn may have been weighing in on you. But the moment Venus moves into Libra, really that Venus opposition Saturn is pretty much over. Okay, it's still in orb, but the fact that Venus is in Libra and Saturn's in Pisces, Saturn and Libra and Pisces are not signs that are in opposition to each other. So as far as I can see, that is really something to welcome. There may be a great sense of relief that you're over that Venus opposition Saturn. And additionally, there is a conjunction between the moon and Jupiter today, and it's tied up with that last quarter moon. So I've already said that last quarter moon might be about other people, and this moon conjunct Jupiter is a reminder that maybe you really can benefit from other people. This is a time with Jupiter in Cancer where you can regard other people as really being a real plus in your life if you give them a chance. And also with moon conjunct Jupiter, you have high expectations. You expect people to really deliver. And if you give them a chance, if you give them the opportunity, then I really do think that they can deliver. Aquarius. Venus is moving into Libra. Venus is moving into an air sign. And of course, when Venus moves into an air sign, it trines... Well, when Venus moves into this air sign, into Libra, that means that Venus is trine Uranus and trine Pluto. That means we've got a grand trine coming up. And so, we had some grand trines earlier on. A few weeks ago I was talking about grand trines. Now we've got more grand trines. And grand trines and air signs are good for Aquarians. And so Venus moving into Libra, as far as you're concerned, just makes things easier. Perhaps recently things have become a little complicated with Venus moving through Virgo, and those complications may have been particularly apparent when having to deal with other people and the complexities of other people's personalities, and it's just maybe not something you necessarily wanted to deal with, but you kind of had to deal with it. And so, it could have been difficult. Plus, we just had a Venus opposition Saturn, and Saturn is of course your ruler. So Venus opposition Saturn, you're still feeling it today, and you're perhaps aware of maybe how different you are, and that sense of separation, and that you just can't get on with everyone. But now Venus moves into Libra, that Venus Saturn opposition just isn't such a big deal anymore. And one thing about Venus moving into Libra, which I should have mentioned, which I sometimes sort of don't notice it, is that, when Venus moves into Libra, Venus is moving into the exaltation of Saturn. Now, Saturn is in Pisces, so Saturn is in the exaltation of Venus, because Venus is exalted in Pisces. So Venus and Saturn are in mutual reception by exaltation. And from an Aquarian perspective, that is good news. This means that while Venus is moving through Libra, you're going to, I think, really potentially be quite fortunate. Things are going to work for you on a number of different levels. you know, with Saturn in Pisces, it's possible that you're able to sort of get to grips with certain financial issues which maybe have been sort of brewing and you hadn't really wanted to deal with them, and it's not really what you wanted. But Saturn going retrograde, it's just all a bit of a pain. But now you see a way through, and so really take advantage of Venus moving into Libra. And I mean, Venus is a fast-moving planet. Venus is not going to be in Libra, forever. So Venus moves into Scorpio. When does Venus move into Scorpio? It moves into Scorpio, sort of looks like the 6th and the 7th of November, 6th or 7th of November. So between now and the 6th or 7th of November, really make the most of Venus in Libra, Venus in exaltation Venus in mutual reception to Saturn by exaltation. Really make the most of it. And from a financial view, there's something you can sort out. Something that might have been bothering you, that's just been starting to bother you for the last, sort of month and more, but there is a resolution. And also, with Venus moving into Libra, in mutual reception in mutual reception by exaltation to Saturn, it allows you to see things in a new way. You can, rise above things. You don't have to be stuck in any particular mindset, especially right now when Venus is starting to make a grand trine, Venus trine Uranus, Venus trine Pluto. So don't restrict yourself. I mean, some Aquarians can. If you constantly look down into the mud, you only think about yourself and you think about the past. I mean, this might not seem to be typically Aquarian, but Aquarius is a fixed sign, and once Aquarius gets into a particular groove or a rut, then it might be very difficult to get out, but you can get out because things have changed. Things really are changing, and I think you don't want to sort of underestimate the importance of Venus moving into Libra, and it all comes at the same time as Mars is still moving through Scorpio. So between now and the beginning of November, having Venus in Libra, Mars in Scorpio, really try to make the most of that. Mars in Scorpio, as I've said on numerous occasions, for you Aquarius, is a very ambitious placement. So Aquarius, absolutely don't doubt yourself. There's a huge amount you can achieve over the next month, and it would be a shame to waste it. And you certainly can't be just focusing on the past and how the past might not have been great. Well, that's done and dusted. We now have to think about the future. So if you can be ambitious and future orientated, and you can also accept that things bothering you can be resolved, particularly particularly if you're bothered by financial things. So Aquarius, really things are looking good. Pisces, a lot of planets in water signs. We have got a Moon-Jupiter conjunction, and Moon-Jupiter conjunctions in Cancer are always, or should always be, good for Pisceans. And so it's a day, Pisces, when I think that things are starting to move, and there's a lot of reason to be optimistic. So you don't have to be stuck in any one place. That Venus opposition Saturn, which has been a problem, I think it could have been a problem. That Venus opposition Saturn is past its full strength, and when Venus moves into Libra, and it does move into Libra today, that Venus opposition Saturn, at least in its immediate phase, is over. It's just not going to cause the same kind of problems it caused over the last couple of days. And so with that Venus opposition Saturn breaking up, you just may feel better about yourself and also better about other people. There's less restriction, less that you have to worry about, and you can start to think about what is important to you, and you're going to be given I think, a fair amount of protection with that Moon-Jupiter conjunction. And if there's something that you absolutely want to do and it really inspires you, then it might be just a time to go for it and not allow your own reservations to hold you up. It is a last quarter moon, so that Moon-Jupiter conjunction is square the Sun, and so we're at the end of a lunar cycle. The last quarter of a lunar cycle is coming up, and this Moon-Jupiter conjunction, is perhaps challenging you to be yourself. Perhaps you haven't always been yourself, and it's part of it might have been that Venus opposition Saturn. You perhaps felt that you had to deal with other people, the complexities of other people. Even if it wasn't just other people, things were complicated, and you were wondering why things were complicated. And you then thought that because things were complicated, you couldn't do what was important to you because you were taking too much of a risk, or something might go wrong. But with Moon-Jupiter conjunction square the Sun, it's kind of telling you that it's okay. In fact, it's not just okay, it may be important, it may be essential. Because if you don't do what matters to you right now, then it's possible that you miss your chance, and that's not something that should happen. So it's important, Pisces, to just start the week on the right footing. And the right footing is very much to be putting yourself first, and not feeling that you have to be pressurized. And that pressure might not just come from other people, it might come from your own worries and your fears. You feel you can't do it, you're not good enough, you might get resistance, there might be opposition, but it's not true. This Moon-Jupiter conjunction here, it's a great aspect, and it's going to push you forward, and it's going to allow you to really make the most of whatever it is that you've got. And those are my forecasts for the 12 signs. And now I want to look at things from the viewpoint of the I Ching. So I asked the question, what is Monday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 11, which is peace. It's a good hexagram. It gives us the idea that things are moving. There's just a constant flow, and perhaps there have been recent concerns that things were perhaps blocking the flow, that things weren't in the right place. But as we sort of move into Monday, we just feel better about ourselves, and it just feels that everything is in the right place. And everything is in the right place here, because we've got 3 unbroken lines at the bottom of the hexagram. That trigram is the bottom trigram is very positive, very energetic. It's in the right place, it's grounded. Then at the top we've got 3 broken lines, so that is pure negativity. So you can see that it's quite a powerful hexagram, and things are moving. At least it appears that they're moving. But we do have the 4th and the 6th lines moving, the 4th and the 6th line moving, and so with the 4th line moving, it's very important that we really do go with the flow, that we don't have any pretensions, that we don't sort of force things. And the I Ching uses this word fluttering. So it's kind of saying that we should flutter. Now I don't quite know how that relates to you. But my understanding of fluttering is, if you're fluttering, you're not entirely committed. You're just coming down. You're not making a big fuss about it. You're just fluttering around. You're moving from one place to another. But it's using the word fluttering in a positive sense. I mean, I know that there's a negative connotation to the word fluttering. if there's something insincere about it, it's not focused on anything. But it might also be talking about having a light touch. Just, literally going with the flow, where the breeze flows. One flutters down. One certainly doesn't announce oneself. One doesn't give the impression that one is anything special. And that is important, not to be boastful, to be completely spontaneous. And by doing that, by fluttering, we are facilitating the general flow. So there is a lot of flow. And then the sixth line moves, suggesting that there's only flow up to a point. And with the sixth line, we've reached the top of the hexagram. So things were going well. There was a sense of peace. There was a sense of harmony. But something in the end goes wrong. Or perhaps it's reached its conclusion. Something maybe sort of collapses in on itself. And that's the image that the top line is given. Something finally caving in. A castle falling into its own moat. And that does sound rather difficult. I mean, worse than difficult. And it could be that we're just at the end of one stage. Something is coming to an end, and it's perhaps, in the end, falling apart. Perhaps the contradictions are just too much. Although, as far as what we can do, maybe we've been too hasty. Maybe we've acted too quickly, too vigorously. We were trying to do something. We were trying to have an impact. We got a conflict. And this is a situation, in the end, when something starts collapsing, we've certainly got to look after ourselves and our loved ones, and people are important, but we can't stop it. That's what the suggestion is. We need to let the movement happen, because once that movement has happened, we can move to a very different situation. And this is the issue with this hexagram. It kind of starts off well, then we've got a major problem, and then we move to another hexagram, which is hexagram number 14, which is a brilliant hexagram. 14 is about what we have, possession in great measure. It's kind of saying, whatever's happened, maybe something did collapse, doesn't change us, doesn't change what we've got. We've still got everything we need. And additionally, possession in great measure can have a financial dimension. It's a possibility of getting hold of money. And we shouldn't forget that astrologically there is a conjunction between the moon and Jupiter in Cancer. It's a great conjunction. And so if there's something that we want to get hold of, in spite of perhaps temporary setbacks, something having to collapse, and we didn't like the fact that it had collapsed. When the harmony is broken, it seems really difficult. But in this case, when the harmony breaks, that is strangely a good omen. So if today you see something going wrong, something just breaking up, something almost appearing to be a disaster, maybe that's a sign that things are starting to work, that things are starting to move. And once the dust has settled, possession in great measure, we haven't lost anything. And in fact, there are things we can gain, and we can increase our possessions. And of course, when we're talking about possessions, we're not just necessarily talking about money. It can be our wisdom, it can be our knowledge, it can be our prestige, whatever it is that is important to you. And finally, I want to quickly look at this explosion in Tennessee. And one reason I wanted to look at this explosion is because it did happen around the time of a conjunction between the moon and Uranus. So let's just look at the chart for this explosion. So here's the explosion. I make it that it took place on October the 10th, 2025 at 7:48 a.m. in Bucksnort, Tennessee. And perhaps the reason I found this interesting is because it did happen at the time of a Moon-Uranus conjunction. And I was talking about the Moon-Uranus conjunction a few days ago. I was sort of warning about it. It seemed rather difficult. I was indicating that, within maybe 3 hours of this conjunction, one might expect something to happen. Well, this is more than 3 hours. This would, Moon and Uranus are about 4 degrees apart, so this would have been approximately, off the top of my head, about 8 hours after the conjunction. But it's very symbolically fitting that at the time of this explosion, the Moon and the Uranus were making this conjunction in the 8th house, the house of death. I don't know whether you can regard Algol as being on the 8th house cusp. I don't know about fixed stars and cusps. I mean, Algol on the cusp of the 8th, you could say, is symbolic of death, a particular kind of death. And I think that, remember, 16 people were killed, I believe. A few others were injured. And so Moon Uranus in the 8th house perfectly describes death by explosion, even if you don't want to use Algol. Additionally, we have got Pluto on the IC. So Pluto represents something very small happening at maybe a sort of a root level. I mean, I don't know what the cause of the explosion was. I think the information isn't really available at the moment, but Pluto on the IC does indicate a potentially sort of disastrous event. And it's happening at the roots. I mean, the IC is an important angle in that sense. I mean, the IC is, when we think about earthquakes, Uranus on the IC is a sort of a classic configuration of earthquakes. And here we got Pluto here. You might also be interested to know that true Black Moon Lilith was at 0 degrees 45 Scorpio. So Pluto was square true Black Moon Lilith. So Black Moon Lilith was square the IC. So that does give us further information. Now, as far as the 90-degree dial is concerned, so let's look at the 90-degree dial, and so here it is, and the Moon was sort of interesting. So when I look at an explosion like this, I'm often interested in the Mars-Saturn midpoint, because the Mars-Saturn midpoint represents death, or it can represent death, and so the Moon was very, very close to the Mars-Saturn midpoint, sort of just 2 arc minutes. Now, this is going to happen quite a lot. The Moon is going to be on the Mars-Saturn. Moon is going to be aspecting the Mars-Saturn midpoint, every few days. So you can't really use Moon on the Mars-Saturn midpoint to predict events. You have to look at other things, and the Moon. Yeah, it was close to Uranus, but from a 90-degree dial, you need very close aspects, and we don't really see that here. And the Moon was also on the Venus-Mars midpoint, so that reminds us that there's Venus and Mars. They're shown as a conjunction in this chart because it's a 90-degree dial, but of course, on a 90-degree dial, an opposition will be shown as a conjunction. So we had the Venus-Saturn conjunction on one hand, and Mars on the other hand, and the Moon was sort of bringing it all together. And then there is the Sun midpoint. The Sun midpoint is always something to consider, and so looking at the solar midpoint, that can perhaps. So the Sun midpoint was on the Moon Uranus midpoint. Now, why does that matter? The Sun aspecting the Moon Uranus midpoint. Well, the reason it matters is because it's not just Moon Uranus as just a general pair. We already know that there was a Moon-Uranus conjunction. So the question is, when would that Moon-Uranus conjunction be most likely to manifest? Would it be when the Moon-Uranus conjunction was exact, or would it be when the Sun was exactly on the Moon-Uranus midpoint? And there it is. So the Sun was on the Moon-Uranus midpoint. So you can regard that as being a trigger. Though, just looking at the chart of the Tennessee explosion, I mean, we can certainly see stuff in retrospect, but it's one of those situations, could we really have predicted it beforehand? Okay, I said that Moon-Uranus conjunction could be quite explosive. I did a video for the Moon-Uranus conjunction, and on the thumbnail I had a sort of a fire. But well, there are going to be explosions in other parts of the world. Lots of places there would be explosions. Certainly in any war situation, I'm sure there would have been tons of explosions in Ukraine. So just on the basis of this Moon-Uranus conjunction, I don't think I would have been able to predict, when this was, when this was going to happen. Certainly just by looking at the planets, certainly would not be able to predict that it was going to be in Tennessee. I did try to look at the horoscope of Tennessee. So here is the chart of the state of Tennessee. And it apparently became a state on June the 1st, 1796. I've said it for Knoxville. I believe Nashville is the capital of Tennessee, but on June the 1st, 1796, Knoxville was the Tennessee capital. So, I considered the possibility that maybe there were some transits involving the state of Tennessee at the time of the explosion. I didn't find anything. I mean, I'm just doing this to just illustrate, what I was looking at. I mean, we don't have a time for when the state of Tennessee happened. Okay, the state of Tennessee does have a moon in Aries at noon in Knoxville. The moon was at 1715 Aries, so at the time of the explosion, the Sun was opposition the noon moon. But that might just be coincidence, and we don't know. At least I don't know exactly when Tennessee became a state. I assume that there was some legislation. Probably, the legislation would have happened in Washington, and I don't know, maybe it would have gone through at midnight. So I wasn't too impressed by what was going on in Tennessee. Now, one other thing about the explosion chart, which I should have mentioned, which I forgot to mention, is Pluto's on the IC, but it's not just Pluto on the IC, it's Pluto stationary direct. Pluto is stationary at 1 degree 22 Aquarius. So the fact that Pluto is stationary direct, okay, it's retrograde technically at the time of the explosion, but it goes stationary sort of a couple of days later, and so maybe Pluto had extra power because of it stationing. And so finally, I just wanted to look at a chart taking place before the event, in particular the autumnal equinox. So here is the chart for the autumnal equinox set for Bucksnort, Tennessee. So the only thing that comes to mind here, okay, the moon is quite close to the midheaven, but you wouldn't really associate the moon on the midheaven in itself as being about as relating to explosions. I mean, why should it? So one has to kind of dig down at this equinox chart. And one thing, if you look at the equinox chart, and you look at the ascendant and the midheaven, we're looking for something angular here, and the only thing angular we find is the moon. But if we look at the ascendant midheaven midpoint, the ascendant midheaven midpoint, is approximately 15 degrees Scorpio. So the Sun is at 0 degrees 0 degrees Libra. The ascendant midheaven, so the sun is semisquare, the ascendant midheaven midpoint. That might be relevant, although you don't really normally just associate the sun semisquare, the ascendant midheaven midpoint, as being an explosion. Now, the ascendant midheaven midpoint, if you've got something on your ascendant midheaven midpoint, I think I've got Pluto on my ascendant midheaven midpoint, or aspecting my ascendant midheaven midpoint. But the ascendant midheaven is the time and the place. And it's possible that this equinox may have said something about the explosion, but we would have to look in greater detail at the chart of the equinox, and we would have to look at its 90-degree dial. And so if we look at the 90-degree dial of the equinox, then you see there's the ascendant and there's the midheaven. So you can see that the sun is on the ascendant midheaven midpoint. And what we have to think about is other aspects to the Aries point. And so the Aries point was on the Mars-Uranus midpoint. So there's the Mars-Uranus midpoint, and there's the ascendant midheaven midpoint. So the Mars-Uranus midpoint was close to aspecting the ascendant midheaven midpoint. So the ascendant midheaven midpoint is very particular to Bucksnort, Tennessee. And so at that precise moment of the equinox, when the sun went into Libra, the ascendant midheaven midpoint was exactly making a conjunction or some hard or making a hard aspect to the Mars-Uranus midpoint. So we wouldn't necessarily be able to see that just by eyeing the chart. But I think that is probably the relevant aspect. Now, I absolutely understand. I'm looking at this in hindsight. I would not have been able to look at this beforehand, I don't think. But again, if I had been in Tennessee, and I'd been obsessed about the future of Tennessee and what's going on in Tennessee, maybe I would have noticed it, and maybe I could have given some kind of warning. But even then, how would I have known that it was going to be this explosive company? Maybe I could have had the chart of every explosive company operating in Tennessee. You know, it's really difficult and perhaps impossible trying to predict these kind of events beforehand. Yeah, and one can be general about it, like I was saying. Moon-Uranus conjunction did indicate something explosive on that day, but that's, I'm afraid, is not very helpful unless we can be a lot more precise than that. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.